Welcome to the Flex Forward podcast, where grit meets growth. With your host, Nick Espinette, bringing you stories of resilience, reinvention, and the real climb to success.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Flex Forward podcast. Today, we're joined by Anthony Troche. Anthony is a geospatial and geopolitical advisor, and I'll let him explain a little more about what that is. It sounds very fascinating. But Anthony, we're glad to have you today. Can you let our listeners know a little more about you and what it is that you've done in your career and what you're doing now?
Yes, I had a career that spans over 40 years in service in the U.S. federal government. I started back in 1983 as a cartographer in Washington, D.C. after graduating from college, and a few slow starts in various other organizations, but then landed my dream job at the time, which is an organization back then named Defense Mapping and Hydrographic Topographic Center, which focused at the time building charts and maps for the armed forces and a few other organizations. I studied geography in college, graduated University of Florida, and it was kind of something I wanted to do ever since I was a much younger person. I was always fascinated by the maps in National Geographic, and I had a diverse childhood, born in Puerto Rico, grew up part of my life in the Midwest and the United Kingdom, ended up going to college in Florida, and I traveled an awful lot as a younger person. So I was always fascinated by maps and doing my own maps. And I was good at geography even when I was in junior high school in Wales. So once I got the job as a cartographer, of course, it was a basic entry level job. These are the days of drafting maps in pen and ink form and lighting and tables. And my initial job was working to produce charts for navigation at sea for the ships of the Navy. And I was eventually got pretty good at it, and later on became an instructor. I enjoyed teaching and just the introduction classes to newcomers. And from there, I learned about another organization at the time called Defense Mapping School, which focused not just teaching cartography, but teaching cartography to support our international agreements overseas. Because the agency or the organization, which today is called National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, had and still has agreements with various mission partners across overseas in Latin America, Europe, and other places that were produced like contractors and products or standards. So I inquired about jobs there. They were hard to find. Nothing really occurred for a while. Then in 1992, there was an issue. They needed somebody to teach a cartographic management course in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and nobody could be found. So I was asked, could I go as a volunteer and teach a class for 6 weeks in Buenos Aires? And I rose up to the challenge, and with not a lot of preparation did it. It was hard work, but I enjoyed it immensely. Enjoyed the engagement between myself, our mission partners in Argentina, the embassy personnel. Enjoyed demonstrating our latest technology at the time. Then I came back to my routine job. And 2 years later, I finally, in 1994, I eventually did get the job formally as a cartographic instructor to teach nautical cartography overseas. There was many ways as my dream job, kind of mid-career, early career. So I did that from 1994, 1998. I traveled 3 to 5 months of the year worldwide, mostly Latin America, Eastern Europe. The Cold War had just been over, so I visited Estonia, Latvia, Albania, several visits there. And that was fascinating to be working in that environment. In Latin America, we had a longer history of engagement, so it was not as challenging, but always interesting. Visited most of Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the Guianas. Everywhere else, I pretty much had done a class. The class was a month long. So,
oh wow!
So one had to basically recalibrate one's life for a month. But I've lived overseas before in Europe, so it was not too challenging. The classes, of course, varied. Conditions in, for example, Albania in 1994, 95 were Spartan at best. Sometimes you'd run out of electrical power, so you end up teaching outside the building as best as you could. Not so much in Latin America. But it was very rewarding to have that engagement of leading new personnel to different techniques in producing charts to modern standards, in this case, International Maritime Organization or IHO, and NGA standards or DMA standards at the time. And it was very satisfying. So after doing that for 4 years and getting the taste of this, I did the next logical step was to apply for a job where I'll be overseas for a longer period of time. And in 1998, I got a job as a liaison officer through we have two, at the time we had two offices, one regional offices, one in Guatemala City, another one in Peru, managing our regional affairs there. So I got a liaison officer job attached to the embassy in Guatemala City to manage our co-production agreements and partners across the Central America, Dominican Republic, and Venezuela. So I was the first person to draft digital co-production agreements. By then, 1980, I knew the trend was on. Obviously, we're going to switch over from the manual world to the digital. Sure. And I understood that very clearly in my mind. It was not always so easy with management, but again, it was successful getting the first digital co-production products and agreements in writing. Also, it enabled me to interface and get to know the department state a lot better. I had to work in an environment which I had to participate in embassy country team meetings and support everybody from them to casual maps for travel for personnel in the embassy to DEA and USAID and also CDC, which had an office there, the Center for Disease Control. So a variety of organizations that just basically provide them mapping services. And occasionally you would have an unusual Americans would come in asking about maps and so on, because we were housed not in the embassy, but in the Instituto Geográfico Militar, which is their mapping institute in Guatemala, which is significantly smaller than the agency was out in Washington, D.C. And I remember one particularly unusual couple that came in, actually, they're planning to sort of restart a silver mine somewhere in Guatemala. And I came asking for maps, and they actually came back with actually some silver to show me later time. But those are unusual cases, yes.
Interesting.
Most of the time we were working with the DAO, the Defense Office of Attaché offices across the region. I visited routinely all the capitals of the countries in Central America and interfaced with them and worked towards maintaining good relations and being able to co-production. It was a challenge because the management outlook there was different from the management in other organizations, but I enjoyed it. And towards the end of my tour, I had to find another job. And back then, this is 1998, HR, the digital systems HR that exists today did not exist back then. So a lot of it was just sort of manually done or talking to people back in Washington, D.C. to find a job to return to. And eventually I did through my contacts on, well, there's a job in Bahrain in Fifth Fleet in the Middle East if you might be interested in. You need to require some training to become a geospatial analyst rather than just a liaison officer. I said, yes, I've since already done 3 years and plus 3 months in Guatemala. What's another 2.5 years in the Middle East? Sure, I'll take it. This required me leaving sometime late June, July, and training all the way through October to become a geospatial analyst in Washington, D.C., and I was in Washington, D.C. for September 9/11. I was in Reston Building as actually there and watching the TV as the second tower got hit and telling my manager we need to talk to whoever's in the Pentagon. Of course, we were not able to get anybody in the Pentagon. The Pentagon was on fire. I had visited the Pentagon the previous Friday. Fortunately, it was, of course, not there. But I experienced the trauma of living through 9/11 and everything it meant. So it meant that my job at Fifth Fleet supporting the U.S. Navy in the Middle East, that would seem to be like not a promising job, suddenly became the epicenter of everything. So I hurried up, completed the training, and headed out there in October to Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. My first assignment there, full of people doing TDY work and all kinds of activity. And trying to sort of gain control of my office was a challenge, but I was able to do so. And for a few months when other people departed, it was easier. But it was always a challenge. I enjoyed it very much working directly with the Navy customers and coalition partners because I had to work with NATO and other personnel, which require a lot of it. I mean, within the first 2 weeks there, I was required to take a staff flight plane to Kuwait to interface with the personnel and NGA person. At the time, we went from being a cartographic organization to being an intelligence organization. So I did live that transition also. After 9/11, we became National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. in par with all the other three-letter agencies. So it wasn't just, we were not just producing maps and charts, but producing intelligence products. So I had to relearn a whole other trade craft there. The visit to Kuwait was productive, rough, but good, as initiating to what I would be doing for the next 2.5 years. During those 2.5 years, I did travel around some to UAE, visited 2 aircraft carriers out at sea, when I fly in and fly out to support our mission partners. Very exciting environment to be in. Of course, the operations in Afghanistan were ongoing. Did a lot of learning, but was there also for the transition from the older buildings, which look barrack-like, to a modern office environment, which is much better to work in.
Oh, yeah.
Briefed various senior commanders as they came through.
I bet you got to meet some interesting personalities through all that.
Yes, I did. The personalities for better or worse. I mean, and occasionally we would have the occasional rock star would go through there, like Joan Jett, to morale building for the troops. Actually, did see people like that go through there.
Oh, wow.
Interesting. Yes, yeah, it was. It was
it's
always a
fascinating.
bit
I
of a
think
surprise.
you are the first cartographer I've ever met. I've always been fascinated with maps.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I took a geography of politics, I think. So it was an elective, and it ended up being, it was very fascinating about how people move, and like they're always kind of towards the next biggest city, and how societies moved and transition.
Oh yeah, it's multifaceted. I mean, I became a fan of it since I was reading the National Geographic magazine, which we had at home, and of course the National Geographic shows. I was always good at drawing, so I enjoyed the representation of maps and charts. Of course,
it's fascinating, and just how much you've talked about it. Its transition is. I read a book, "The Path Between the Seas," the building of the Panama Canal. But at that time, how little they knew of the land between where the Panama Canal is. They really didn't even know how high the land was, but where they were going.
No.
It was fascinating to me.
There was no area photography, satellite imagery, or anything such back then. Everything had to be done manual surveys, and that was very time consuming and not easy to do, and often not accurate. The emergence of datums and cartographic standards, as we understand it, they're just beginning, but they're not what they are today. Of course, today everything is imagery driven or drone driven imagery, highly precise, GPS driven as far as horizontal, vertical
where every
control.
Every millimeter probably is almost mapped now for most parts of the world.
It just depends on the type of product or type of map you're trying to do. If it's something smaller scale, you don't need that kind of accuracy. But if you're doing something for road maps, cadastral that requires precise boundaries and so on, yes, you do. You require high resolution imagery. But the thing is, today that's possible. Back in the 1800s, it was not very good.
Yeah. Well, another fascinating was, I think, lines of the Earth. They were trying to prove if the Earth was round or more oval, and they went to Ecuador, and it took them months to get there by ships. I can't remember. It was in the 1800s, and I believe they had a mile long chain where they were doing readings of the sun, of the solar stuff. Maybe it was a very long but very precisely measured chain that wouldn't the heat and the cold didn't change the distance of it. So then they would look at where the sun set on certain days at certain time. So it was fascinating.
It's just trying to establish the proper or the correct location of the equator. So, which obviously is 0 degrees longitude. So it's the only place you can stand and be almost in two hemispheres. I've been to the equators. I mean, stand in two hemispheres, literally have one foot in the northern hemisphere, the other one in the southern hemisphere. The only place in the world you can do that anyway. But yes.
Very fascinating. So as you've worked your way through this, it sounds like, what was something you found easier that others found challenging? It sounds like you've always loved maps since you were a young boy, and love the, geography and things like that. So what along the way was easy for you?
Well, the thing is, but both DMA and NGA, what happens, you not everybody that gets hired on has a background in geography or the physical sciences. You have people from other organizations which don't understand mapping or charting very well. I'll assume it's all the same, and I think the challenge is educating people to understand, not only are we producing products of these X and Y standards, for example, but there's a difference between different types of maps. And there's maps for land navigation, there's maps for aircraft navigation, aeronautical, and ships at sea. And they're not all, I mean, they may all seem to be the same, but they're not. And there are different standards and there's reasons for them, and they're produced at different scales. For example, the standard U.S. Army map is 1 to 50,000 scale. That's just a map for land navigation. That is, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Eastern Europe, it's going to be the same scale for your basic map. That's just, the equivalent of the Google Earth map. Of course, there's other things out there. For navigation, the ships at sea is different. I mean, you have harbor charts highly detailed, coastal less detailed, and then approach charts, of course, are somewhere in between. Aeronautical charts tend to be smaller scale, much larger, because the aircraft, of course, travel faster. And different types of navigational symbology and features on there that you wouldn't find in maps and charts, because they're necessary for aeronautical navigation, not so much for land. For example, length of a runway. Do I need to have that necessarily in a map if I'm not flying a plane? Not really. But for aircraft, yes, that's essential.
Yeah. And not needed at all if you're on a boat, right?
Right. Yeah, other than the fact that it's there, yes, you just need the outline of the airport, that there's an airport, and that's about it. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating how the airports are runways are numbered by the.
Yes, and it depends. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course, so all this is a whole body of knowledge that predates the computer, and often I think, from my impression, just other people it was difficult sort of to grasp that, because not everybody teaches it the same way. But that's just that's just a technical issue. I mean, but it's something that I can't.
Any challenges to your career? What's one of the biggest challenges you've had to?
Well, there are many, because from 2005 through 2010, I was kind of missing the Middle East. I deployed every year first to Iraq, first to Qatar to work at SOCCENT, so Special Forces Command. It's okay assignment, but not too exciting. The next one was Iraq in 2007. Deployed within 2 weeks' notice because nobody could be found that wanted to map the sectarian factions of Baghdad in the middle of the civil war. I said, well, I've done a lot of traveling. I'll do it anyway. So that was a real challenge. It was going in literally the normal procedure that to deploy, doing the medical exams and all the paperwork and everything else. It takes sometimes like 3-4 months to do so. It was expedited in 2 weeks. I flew up to Washington, D.C., and literally flew into Baghdad in the same clothing that I was wearing in Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow.
With very little guidance, I was able to produce a product the first week, because I was walking around the watch floor while I was placed there. Was almost no guidance. A midshipman recognized me from Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and we started talking, pointing me to the right people, and voila, in the first week I had a product, which surprised a lot of people. But I had, the mindset, anyone has to have the toughness in that wartime environment to know when to press forward and not give up in difficult circumstances. So I ended up, over the course of the 4 months I was there, ended up working with the U.S. Embassy, the British Embassy, DIA, and CIA. I went outside the wire, basically, to talk to the Iraqis and this is obviously an armored personnel carrier, and had engagement with Iraqi intelligence. But it was hard. Every night mortar attacks, every night missile attacks. That was having your trailer shaking because of an explosion. That just was the normal. So it was tough conditions, but I did what I had to do. Ended up working also. Some of the hardest missions are really the missing in action searches. That was very difficult to do. Emotionally very challenging.
That's so.
Did some volunteer work, actually giving food to Iraqi families too when we could do so. Then my next assignment after that was Afghanistan, NATO ISAF, and so I wanted to go and see, basically get some experience there. That was also, in many ways, it's almost harder than Iraq. Conditions were just very difficult. I ended up working, that was in 2008, 3 months working night shifts in the watch floor. So all kinds of wartime environment things, highly stressful events that occurred. Also saw how much stress that inflicted upon the personnel working there. People there, especially that have not traveled much or not experienced much, really have a hard time. Although there was a gym and you could run around the small base, it was a challenge. Then my last deployment was from 2009, December 2009 to June 2010, and back again in Baghdad. working with the CST, which is cryptological mission in Baghdad. But I ended up doing a variety of things. It was not as dangerous as 2007, but we did have a series of attacks here and there, which is kind of the normal. Work with all kinds of organizations, which I did enjoy. And I think after 5 years of deploying, that seemed to be enough. One does gain a lot of experience and knowledge of being out in the field, and also began to notice that not everybody is cut out to be out in the field. I did see people that some had to be sent back, some that were held there, but they were just barely holding themselves together. It happens in the military too. A lot of things. They see a lot that you're not going to see in the media, and some of it for good reason. Yeah. Then later on, I continued working here at what's called NSA Texas. NSA has remote assignments across the country, besides their main base in NSAW, and NGA has personnel attached to these assignments. They're located in Georgia, San Antonio, Hawaii, Denver. This is nothing secret. You can find this anywhere online.
Okay.
So I joined the team here in 2004 after finishing my tour in Bahrain. And then from 2010 forward, actually 2012 forward on, I had what I felt like it's almost like 2012, 2018, but really one of my golden age in my career. I started working the cyber issues kind of by accident, and I began to ask myself, well, I know, and so I do have some knowledge about networks and establishing networks and so on, and wondered, well, I know hacking is occurring all over the world. What would that look like space over time over a map? That was just an open-ended question, had no data. Well, eventually, by chance, I was able to find a team in NSA that had data for me. And again, so what I'm saying is, can't give out sources and methods, but eventually what I was able to create is, for the sources that they gave me, I'm not going to say which kind, what had occurred in hacking across the U.S. from 2006 through 2012, space over time. I was able to represent it by industry, government, aerospace, high tech, universities, and so on, and could demonstrate how that threat had increased from then, and how that shift across the eastern border and the Pacific coast had increased the intensity of the intrusions, not attacks, just intrusions in the U.S. Well, at the time, I didn't realize it. A lot of my teammates said, "Oh, surely somebody else must have already done that." Well, it turns out, when I realized that later, I was the first person in history to have ever created these types of products. Now they're more commonplace, but at the time, nobody had ever done that.
What a neat thing to say I'm glad you did it to help for protection, and that you came up with that. That's awesome.
Yeah, that was one of 3 presidential daily brief products which I created in cyber. Created 2 more beyond that. Means that these are products that are briefed to the president, senior staff in Congress, and the Pentagon, and the Secretary of Defense at the time requested a unclassified graphic for me to create for him to brief Congress. So this is once of a career sort of thing. And I discovered a year later, I was informed that the director of NSA had my slides in his briefcase everywhere he traveled. And what this enabled to do so is basically to demonstrate to senior staffers in government and the military, understand that the real threat as it's emerging in cyber without being an expert in the field, without having somebody brief all the technical details in cyber, which for somebody who's not an expert in the field would be hard to understand even today. So that communicated the issue very well, and that was the success of it. Beyond that, I continued working other cyber issues in cybercrime. I worked in there's actually a Wire magazine story called Slavic Hunting the Phantom. That I worked that mission. If you look up in Wire magazine. Then also created 2 additional presidential daily briefs in cyber infrastructure. Again, unique products never done before. They went the same route, a brief to the president, to senior staffers across all government. So I was very happy with that. Later on, I worked cybercrime in various other ways. Began to understand the cybercrime ecosystem very well, and also worked a little bit of the money laundering side with some successes there. And beyond that, I also worked the Latin America mission to some extent. In the last mission I worked in 2022 before I retired was a Ukraine mission remotely from 22 to 23, and retire in January 2024. Yeah. In
Awesome.
between that, also did do Naval War College and Command and Staff in 1999. That was truly a really good move to do so as a graduate level program. And in retrospect, it was important because I had a lot of theoretical classes in war that I saw become reality in 9/11, and then into cyber, effects and everything else I'd seen later. But back then it was theory, and actually lived through seeing, oh yes, the theorizing and the possible is important and necessary because you just never know. And I saw it
when
become
it's going to
reality.
become well,
But in addition to that, other personal details, I had 25 years as a triathlete. I started in Guatemala because I was bored.
Oh,
So all these years, I did from 1994 to 25 years of triathlon, including Ironman Maryland, Iron Arizona, and a bunch of other races. So
that's impressive. What a great career. Thank you for sharing all that. As we're wrapping up, do you have any exciting initiatives or plans in the work for the next 6 to 12
yes, I
months?
retired, but I will tell anybody, if you're bored in retirement because you want to. Right now, I work with the Youth Global Leadership Coalition, by which an organization which it's nonpartisan, privately funded, which we go do a visit to Congress every year. We'll do this in June, and lobby to maintain good diplomatic and social and cultural relations between the rest of the countries that we engage with, to sustain programs that otherwise may be in jeopardy, which we believe essential, not just for commerce, but also for good diplomatic relations. I also recently joined FBI InfoGuard, a cybersecurity volunteer organization. And I belong to other organizations that I work with. Also recently got had an interview of sorts with a company to do consulting work. They're based in Singapore, but they also have U.S. clients. So I'll be knowing more about that next week. I also had an interview with Swiss Radio 3 weeks ago, for me to basically describe a paper I wrote for the Middle East Forum, another organization that I worked with in the recent past, showing how unclassified imagery was used during the 2025 Israel-Iran conflict. And I also do creative fiction writing also. I do enjoy doing that. Started during COVID, and that's another thing. And I stay fit and healthy. At
Hey,
67, I don't have any
busier than
health issues.
most of the population. That's awesome. Well,
Yeah,
first
last
of
year I
all,
did
thank you.
Ragbide, the ride across Iowa. The year before that, climbed Albert
Yep.
in Colorado. So
Yeah, I've heard of Ragbide. I used to cycle a lot. I don't near as much now, but we get out on my bike every once in a while. Well, thank you, first of all, for all your service to the country. Thank you for joining me today. If people would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out?
yeah, LinkedIn or email. I'm always happy to mentor anybody if they're not sure about what direction to take in their career, and it doesn't have to be geography. I can advise in other issues also, other career fields too. It's just I
Awesome.
think one has to be motivated. One has to find what one is good at, that one's strengths, and develop from there and find a career that satisfies oneself. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening today. Be sure to like and share this episode and reach out to Anthony if you have any interest in what he's talking about. What a great bunch of information he shared with us today. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Flex Forward podcast. If you've got grit, growth, and a great story, visit flexforwardpodcast.com/guest to apply and join us on the show.